All right, we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome to today, September 18th, 2024. We're here with a cohort of both our MedTech innovators and our BioTool innovator cohorts to talk about building better boardrooms, how to prevent a board room. And I'm really excited to share with you our panelists today. And let me get these slides up here. We'll do it the fun way. So the way these normally work is we live stream the first hour, and that's for everybody. We store that in our digital archive, and then after the first hour, we go into a private Q&A amongst our cohort and the panelists to ask any questions that they have on a personal basis. And I am your host, Jim West. I'm the Associate Director here at BioTools Innovator. And I've been an entrepreneur in the past. I went through the first year of BioTools Innovator. And so I've actually had a little bit of experience building and managing a board, but did it from the entrepreneur side in a startup. And I'm excited to talk to our panelists here today. We've got Brandon Bindis from Woven Orthopedics, former MedTech innovator, cohort founder. We've got Dan Calvo at Sequel, also a cohort, I believe. We got Renee Ryan at NeuroPace and Reflection Medical, and we've got Sammy Dotwani at Systemic Bio. And so I'm going to stop the share here and want to kick it off to Sammy. Could you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your experience with background with boards?
Sure. Great to meet everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. My background, I have a technical background and a doctorate in fluid mechanics, 24 years in the Bay Area working with early stage startups, mostly on life science tools and molecular diagnostics. I'm currently the Chief Product Officer at Systemic Bio. The company is an organ on a chip company, and my background is in microfluidics, so I thought this was a good opportunity to jump in as the Chief Product Officer and sort of drive the product. My previous roles have included board roles and advisory board member at Johns Hopkins University, where I went to school. I'm currently with the Life Science Angels, also on their board as a director, and formerly an independent board member with Combinati, which exited to Thermo. This is a BTI alumni company. Currently with the board of directors of Seldom, and formerly the board of Society of Lab Automation and Screening, to give you a flavor of the things I look at. Pleasure to meet you all.
That's great. So a little bit of industries, a little bit of nonprofits. That's really great. Renee, could you introduce yourself, please?
Great. Nice to see everybody here today. Renee Ryan, my background is more on the medtech side. I actually had the great fortune of being an early participant and partner to MedTech Innovator when it first got going, and actually sat on the board of MedTech Innovator. Everyone knows it's a not-for-profit. And so in the early days, sat on the board of MedTech Innovator as well. Today, I am on a public company board, which is NeuroPace, which is in the field of epilepsy. And then Reflection Medical, which is a private company here in the Bay Area working in cancer therapy. And also former CEO and investor and investment banker.
Just a little bit of extra at the end there. Good stuff.
Exactly.
Awesome. And Dan, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Hello, everyone. So I'm Dan Calvo. I'm currently the CEO of a next-gen sequencing library prep tools company in the Boston area. I've sort of had two splits in my career. For the first, I would say 40 plus years in the field. So a lot of gray hair, but thank God I'm still here. And so the first part of my career was with DuPont Company, who used to be number 8 on the Fortune 10, and now they've dissipated greatly. And so I was in their more traditional chemical polymers business, got into the biotech side of their world, life sciences, diagnostic imaging. And so that was a great sort of career progression. We pulled out one of the businesses through a private equity group, management buyout, took that private, which was my first foray into the the world outside of what I would call corporate America. And then that company was ultimately sold to PerkinElmer, now called Revity. Stayed at PerkinElmer as their chief commercial officer for several years. And then the second half of my career, starting in 2003, was what I call my hobo CEO tour. The first of 5 CEO roles, I'll get it right eventually, was a tools company in the Pittsburgh area, and then another tools company, and then a diagnostics company in Kansas City, a tools company in Sweden, and now Sequel here in the Boston area. So the big company experience was very helpful, but I will tell you, a lot of big company people can't sort of make that transition to small companies. We may talk about that later. And so I've been on various boards besides my own companies, both private equity backed and VC backed, as well as one nonprofit. So it's great to be here.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Great background there. And last and certainly not least, Brandon Bendis. I met Brandon just a few months ago. He was on another panel here for MedTech Innovator, and I heard him talk, and I'm just like, man, this guy gets bored. So I was happy to see that you were able to make this one too. So Brandon, could you introduce yourself to the group?
Yeah, Jim, appreciate the kind words too. Good to see you again. Good to be back and doing this again. And in short, I would say, I'm a multi-time business builder. And if there's one thing that I'd share about myself, is that at this point, I've spent about 65% of my career on the transaction side, investment, transactions, acquisitions, 45% on the operating side. Currently the CEO of Woven Orthopedics. And as Jim mentioned, we went through MTI a couple of years ago. So I've been through exactly what you're going through now. And I can appreciate the value of boards from both sides of the table. So hopefully some of the things we share today, I can provide some things to consider and some war stories for things to consider as you build your boards, and always curious to hear what you all find to be working for you. Because as a multi-time business builder, I keep building these too, and always want to hear what works for other people.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for the intro, guys. I think this is great because we've got such a variety of backgrounds. We've got people with public, private, nonprofit experience, U.S., international, founder, investor, and independent. This is a great group here. And so, when we think about boards, they come in a different variety of flavors, especially for our sort of life science and medical device companies. You can have your fiduciary board of directors. You can also have perhaps your scientific advisory board, or other advisory boards around the company where you kind of bring in experts. And Brandon, maybe you can kick it off. Can you kind of describe to us, especially for those who maybe haven't had a board before or thinking about putting a board together, what really is the value of a board, and how should companies be thinking about these boards and structures as they're building their companies now and into the future?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things that we all have to consider, like anything else when we're doing something, is in a startup or an earlier stage environment, we tend to put a lot of emphasis on making the right decisions quickly, and there are a lot of things to think about. So we get a little bit of paralyzed, and maybe we start going in a bunch of directions and start thinking about all types of things and get a little frazzled. And what I've realized, and we're talking here about boards of directors, right? So not really the advisory board is not really what you mentioned on that side. The way that I look at it kind of is a board serves 5 purposes, right? One of them is to help guide strategy. And that's everything from your vision, your mission, your strategic plans, how you go about raising capital, things like that. The other one is ensuring governance and proper risk management, so that you're operating the business both legally and ethically based on the regulations you face. Another one is allocating resources. Studies show that the top businesses allocate resources best. So that's your budgets, your audits, your capital, and how you deploy your capital. Number 4 is making sure that your board represents your stakeholders, so that you're ensuring that all the decisions in your company are being made in the best interest of your shareholders. And then 5 is to monitor performance, which a lot of people like to say. We've had a comment here that I've heard before is, hiring, firing the executive team, especially your CEO. So if we think about a board in those 5 ways, then the tactics we use to build our board, as long as they fill those and we're doing it appropriate to the stage of our business, it's a lot easier to figure out what moves to make because we're going towards an end goal.
That's great. Dan, I know we're not talking about advisory boards, but just to be clear, can you kind of tell us about the difference in responsibilities and uses of an advisory board versus what are kind of the responsibilities and fiduciary responsibilities that comes along with an actual board of directors? What's the
Sure.
difference in the meaning of those?
Yeah. So, depending again on your strategy, and I have an example of this with the diagnostics business where we definitely needed what I would call, therapeutic or medical KOLs to help guide our business, our strategy, if you will. But I have found that for several reasons, it's better not to load your board and maybe not even include that kind of person on your board as a permanent board, as a board member. Board members tend to be, in my view, forever, as opposed to shifting strategies where all of a sudden you're going down a different therapeutic road than you were, and you got somebody potentially on the board that maybe doesn't fit anymore. And certainly boards are going to be dynamic over a multi-year period anyway. But getting that advisory capability through an advisory board, typically those are scientific advisory boards. And I would also suggest that every CEO, startup, which I'm not, further, sort of scale up CEO, which I am, you should make sure you have a mentor or two to go to, right? And it's good to go to your board. I hope you can develop a relationship with your board or your chairperson for that role. But it's also important to have that mentoring outside of a formal board or even an advisory board. So I guess what I'm saying is you as a CEO of a startup need guidance from various people. And I think the board is one area as we described, but there are certainly, there's definite room for a more fluid, if you will, advisory board that is going to operate differently, but still end up being a success factor in getting you moving in the right direction.
Great. Thanks, Dan. To build on that, Renee, I'd like to ask you, if you have anything to add to that, but really, what is the role of the board through the life cycle of a company? When is the role of the board and the things that you think about with the board the same at an early stage of the company versus kind of a late stage or even a public version of a company? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, as a company raises more capital and advances the business, clearly you see more of an investor look to the board. One of the things I did when I was the first investor in a company that I ultimately ran as CEO, the company was called Cala Health. I actually led the Series A. And in that term sheet, we actually put in an independent director. And then we made the very same decision that Dan
Sorry,
just.
can you just quickly explain what is an independent director versus another type of director?
Yep. Yep. An independent director is really a director that longer term, if you think about public companies, are representing the common shareholders versus the investors themselves. And oftentimes this person comes with a specific subject matter expertise that they can bring to bear. And to Dan's point, as a company evolves, in the early stages, you want to have more of the scientific expertise at the table. We got that through our scientific advisory board and ended up keeping that independent seat open all the way through the Series C, after which the company was going to be commercial stage. And so we brought on someone who had a very big depth of commercial expertise to fill that independent role. And what I say now, and Dan made the comment about board members are hard to, once they're on your board, they're hard to remove. If we had had a commercial stage person in those early days, I don't think we would have gotten the benefit of it. I think we needed it at the time that we were launching our product, which ended up being about 4 or 5 years into the company's trajectory. And so we were able to keep that independent seat open through all the subsequent rounds of financing.
So is there a risk or a challenge in terms of like you made a strategic decision to keep a seat but keep it unfilled?
Mhm.
Was there a strategic reason you were, is it difficult to fire a board member or to let them go and replace them with someone else? Like what does that look like?
It typically is. I mean, I have not seen it done very successfully. I think over time, and now that I'm on a public company board, we stand for reelection, and there are times when that can turn over. Or in fact, sometimes people self-select and they raise their hand and say, I'm not needed anymore, and I've got other priorities, and my dance card is full. So, but generally, it is difficult to remove a board member once they've started on the journey with you.
Okay. Excellent. And Sammy, could you talk to us just about kind of the different roles within a board? I've heard about these things. There's the chairman of the board, there's the secretary, there's the person in charge of the finances, the treasurer. Can you talk to these different roles in the board and what company should be thinking about in terms of these roles? Do they need them all or the other ones? What should a company be thinking about?
Yeah, great question. I think it really depends on what stage of the company you are. I think that, with a early stage startup, I don't think you need to necessarily you need to by name have a treasurer, a secretary, and a chairman of the board. Uh, Sometimes if the board is small, you might be wearing a couple hats. So as the board evolves, you have to make sure all of those functions are represented. I tend to think of the board as kind of a core team. And one thing I think want to throw out to the group is, the CEO reports to the board. And if that's the case, we have to make sure there's governance. We have to make sure, there's a compensation committee. We have to make sure there's directors and officers insurance in case things go awry. There's a lot of pieces that I think change through the evolution of the board. Uh, I give you one example when a company I was involved with exited, and you need a shareholder representative to make sure the milestones get paid out, and those seem to sort of fall apart, and you need to sort of highlight who those, who's going to sit in that seat, and it may not be the independent board director. It could be somebody more attuned with the finances. So I think there's an evolution, and there are certain roles that have to be filled, and sometimes you have to wear two hats. I was on a board with some of the legal team was represented by Wilson Sonsini, and they took the secretary role, and they took it very seriously. And you had the minutes; they were published. We approved the minutes every meeting.
That's great. We didn't really talk about this before, but could you also kind of describe, with the board of directors, whether it's the CEO or independents or investors, they've got this thing called a fiduciary responsibility that goes along with that position. It's an ethical and a legal position. Can you kind of describe to the group what that means and what is a fiduciary responsibility and what should a founder kind of know about what that is and what it means?
Do you want the finance people to
Yeah,
answer that?
Sammy. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I mean, you have a monetary responsibility to do what's right for the company, and sometimes you have to go through audits and make sure the books are done correctly. There's constant homework. If you get to a point where you're running out of funds, you need to have some money in arrears in case you have some debt to pay. You just have to make sure that the company is functional and doing the right things by the investors, right? You have to keep some money aside, for example, if you're running out of money. There's a lot of financial obligations, and I think that's where I brought in, that you do need to have things like D&O insurance, because you want to make sure folks are protected and we're not doing things the wrong way.
Yeah, if I could add to that, Jim,
Yeah.
I'm glad, the legal side, the fiduciary side, again, my experience is I don't recommend putting that, I'll call it legal advisor or legal representative on the board. And maybe nobody's ever done that. I know they have because I've seen it. again, I think that's where, a trusted advisor that hopefully isn't too expensive, that can give you that guidance as you go, and educate you, frankly, is again one of those network requirements, in my view, that either you can bring or depending on your financial partner, but they're out there and they're well worth, having, a dial up on your speed dial, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, has anybody ever seen a situation where a founder or somebody on the board got in trouble legally, financially because they broke a fiduciary responsibility? Have there been repercussions that you have experienced or seen happen with anybody out there?
I have not. I have not.
Yeah, well, I would say, not sort of 3 people removed, if you will. So I'm certainly aware that it's happened, simply because, and just being frank here, the CEO thought they knew what was right and what they thought is right, and they did something that wasn't right. And, there's a lot of other small people around that will call them on it. And if you avoid that versus find yourself knee deep in it, it happens. I mean, shareholder suits happen. I mean, we've all read about some of those things, and I would say 9 times out of 10, if not higher, those can be avoided with the right thought process up front. It may be a low risk, but it's certainly a deep risk if you miss it.
Dan hit it, right? I mean,
Yeah,
Dan hit it on the head right here, which is this is the purpose of your board. You've created a team to prevent that, right?
Yeah.
We're all running businesses. A lot of the decisions we've had, especially if we're breakthrough unique products and businesses, you may be operating in a domain that didn't exist 10 years ago, that there isn't a laundry list of actions to follow to do things the right way. At the end of the day, we're trying to do it the best that we can. And oftentimes, quite often, you ask the question, Jim, have we ever seen it? I've seen it 100. I see it every board meeting, every interaction, every something. Someone has an idea. We bring it up. We talk about it. And as a team at the board level, we can say, well, if we're going to do that, we have to consider these things, right? Don't overstep this boundary. Make sure we do it this way. Do we want to provide an extra level of oversight or control over something so that we make sure that it does right and looks right? I mean, that's the evolution, that if you set up your board properly, they will help everybody on the team to make sure it is done correctly, so you don't wind up in that situation. Unfortunately, I do know a number of people. I have not been a part of it, thankfully, but I do, not, one person away. So very close peers, colleagues, and partners of mine that have been through that with companies. And it's awful, right, to have to go through that. And usually it comes down to exactly what has been said here. Someone does something, they didn't even realize what they were doing was wrong at the time they did it, and it came back to bite them. So you build the right team, you build the right board, and hopefully you can prevent that inactive discussion.
Great. Pro tip, if you can avoid getting sued, avoid getting sued. So
Write that one down.
write that one down. All right. So let's talk about, sort of the board structure and composition of the board. We've kind of touched on it a little bit, but again, you're early stage company, you're either pre-seed, you're in seed, you're going to market. You've raised capital from friends, family, angels, and maybe venture capital. At what stage should a company founder, especially a first-time founder, really start thinking about formalizing a board and preparing for that board journey? Renee, could you take this one?
Sure, happy to. So most of the times I see a board get serious is when the institutional capital comes to the table. Oftentimes what I'll find at the pre-seed or seed stage, the entrepreneurs usually have, pretty high EQ that they can't do it themselves. So they may have a couple founders alongside of them, but having someone who has an external lens on what you're doing to provide some oversight, maybe to share the scars they have from the mistakes they've made, is a helpful resource. And oftentimes that person is considered a board advisor or a board member. But again, I don't see it more formalized until a Series A financing, typically with institutional capital, comes to the table.
Dan, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I'm not a startup entrepreneur. My roles have always to come in, if you will, behind the technical founder, hopefully with the technical founder, depending on the situation. And most of the time it's gone really well. And so the board is there. I have made changes, and I think to what Renee said earlier, those changes, if sort of sold in the right way because of the transition, to bring somebody on differently with a commercial scale up versus, you're still doing whatever you're doing to prove concept of the capability of the technology. And in that scenario, maybe a thought to the CEOs here, and, at some point, and you sort of have to really look at yourself and say, am I the right person to take this into the market and to grow it from, a $500,000 to 50 mil? And, the $10 million mark in a lot of companies, I mean, there are some tough thresholds along the way. And it's a different skill set in so many ways. And so back to the board composition, not only might the CEO need to change, but the board, typically you would bring on somebody who has done it, in a very similar way, in a similar industry, again, as the strategic advisor in that sense on a board. And sometimes the investors will sort of require that, if you will.
Brandon, as someone who's built a couple companies here, would you consider having a board before your Series A? Is there a benefit to actually having a board and being proactive about that? Or would it be in the founder's best interest to wait until it's sort of, quote unquote, imposed upon them?
So I think Renee made a really, really good point of when the board becomes required, right? As soon as you raise your first round and you have to answer to anybody else now, right? Because you're trying to operate a business in the best interest of your shareholders legally, as soon as your first dollar from an outside source is in your company, you are no longer answering to yourself, right? So at that point, I would almost say legally, it would be very wise to have a board in place, because that adds a level of protection that shows you're doing the right thing between you and now your co-owners. So the first thing I would say is, from a legal perspective, I would say pretty much for me, every time there would be a board in place, at least when the first dollar of capital is raised. The way that I like to do it is, I think boards are helpful from day one. And I think the key to having them from day one is the plan for growing them. I mentioned in the beginning, there's 5 things that a board does, right? The strategy, the governance and risk, the allocation of resources, monitoring the team, right? We mentioned the 5 things that the board does. The question then is, how do you set up your board from day one to evolve over time so that it could do all those things? And there's nothing wrong with establishing a plan. And as you speak to people to bring them on as board members to serve on your board, they are well aware of where the board is going. What I'm very curious about, because this is where I should say one of the things I struggle with and struggle with today as well. Renee mentioned this, Sammy mentioned this, Dan mentioned this. It is oftentimes with smaller companies, it is, I don't want to say difficult to remove board members, but as the company changes its stage, you need different levels of skill, different levels of commitment, and a board member who signed up in the very early stages may not want to be active in a later stage of your business. So how do you position, I'm very curious to hear, aside from what public companies do, which is terms, how can people set it up to ensure that the evolution is natural, people are aware of it, it's not a negative or a positive to go on or off at different stages, but you're building the company in a trajectory? establishing that trajectory from the beginning, I think, is very important, whether you execute it from the beginning or not.
Yeah. Okay, great. Sammy, can you talk to us about kind of again from the early company perspective? One, who from the founding team or should be on the board, and who should the founding team be looking for in terms of maybe their first real board member seat?
Yeah, great question. Agree with what Brandon and Renee said, but at the early stage, you probably got to, if you don't have a technical CEO, you might have the CTO wearing that hat. And as the company evolves, essentially, if the CTO was part of an academic institution was going back, that would then naturally free up the board seat. But initially, I would say that seed, pre-seed, you should be looking to have at least a 3-person board and kind of balancing that out. Either you could bring in an independent or whoever is invested early at the early stage, the largest check-in may require to ask for a board seat. So as that grows, you get to the next round, you might want to bring in another 1 or 2 board members, and you really should be having board observers along the way of people that you're thinking of that could be brought in, that could be helping either strategically or on the financial side. But I see a lot of differences at the early stages that need to evolve. When you start bringing in institutional money, they're going to ask for a board seat. And, naturally, if it's somebody going back to the university, that's an easy route. If they're a CTO that's involved with the company, that may be open to stepping down and opening up that seat. So I see a lot of avenues for the change. You could probably structure it based on if you're incentivizing them, obviously through stock that could be, vested, things like that. There may be a natural progression where, hey, you've done your service. It's time for us to bring in some other folks.
Yeah, if I
Yeah.
could,
Oh, go ahead, Dan.
I was just going to pick up on an example I'm getting involved with here. It has nothing to do with SQL. That basically a founder, owner, technical founder wants to scale. So, they're commercial, really built it from the ground up with minimal outside money, and then wanted to scale beyond that. And in this case, it's a PE firm who is that they've been talking to for several months. And it was a very natural sort of move for the PE firm to say, we want to organize the board very differently. And so I think that dialogue between the founder, CEO, and in this case, the PE firm to bring in, help to scale to the board, obviously, fiducial involvement from the firm itself. And then in the case of me, an independent that can do and support the growth. And it's gone very well. I mean, it hasn't been a push and shove. It's just been a natural progression. And so I think it behooves the CEO and as well as, the investment firm coming in to just, sort of bridge that over time. And it's not cold water. It's not bad news. It's good news.
Okay. Whoever wants to pick this question up can. I'm not sure who the best one to ask is, but if you're a company, you've got a KOL, a leading physician, a leading researcher, someone who's kind of on that technical side but doesn't have a lot of a business experience. Are those good people to bring in to your board to say, hey, I've got so and so on my board? Is that a good idea or a bad idea, or what? Do you have any experience with that?
I would guide those types of hires or team members to go onto either a scientific or a medical advisory board. We had both at the last company I ran. And typically physicians, again, I come from the med tech space, physicians, you can pay them their sort of going hourly rate as a consultant, but they don't oftentimes want to own equity. And so the actual board itself is often compensated with equity. And so just to keep it clean, we tended to put those people on our advisory boards instead.
Okay, that's a fair answer. Early board members, you know, for that type of role position, should they be required to invest in the company to have a stake, for filling that role? Do you guys see that either way? Sammy, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I'll take that. You know, occasionally through Life Science Angels, when we lead a deal, we may ask for board seat, and therefore already have invested. And typically it's somebody that's interfacing with the CEO, and the CEO's most likely in agreement because they agreed to this. And then you've got somebody that's invested, that's joined the company. Throughout you know, the normal process where you identify a board member, there, you know, it's, I think it's open. If the board member wants to invest, that means they're excited and they're interested. I think that shows a good level of commitment. And then it may depend on what the stage of the company is, but that seems like it's really in the board members sort of pocket to decide. It shouldn't be sort of a, hey, you need to invest to be on the board. I think that's not playing fair. Ultimately, if they want to and they believe in the technology, you know, it's a journey. It could start off everything being, you know, really hunky-dory and rosy, and then it could change. It could get contentious. And I think, you know, making the decision of who you want on your board should be made independent of whether they invest.
Okay.
Yeah, I would agree 100%. I think it's an offer. It's not a 100% requirement, and it can change over time. Absolutely, Sammy.
Yeah. So
Yeah, I've built boards both ways, and what I've noticed, this is what I've seen so far in building them, is big stage dependency here. Right? The more mature a company is, the later stage you are, the more governance there is. And the more that the less oftentimes, the less the board will meet, the less actual involvement the board needs to have in the business. So what I've found in my experience so far, and it's been interesting to see this, is earlier stages, those that do invest are way more willing to perform more and lend more time, lend more resources. They have more quote unquote skin in the game, which is very helpful for earlier stage businesses. So I've found those of our board members for any of my companies that have invested, that are on the boards, they seem to be way more helpful in the beginning than not. So that's one thing I've noticed. I don't know if Dan, Sammy, Renee, if you've noticed the same thing based on stage, but that's one thing I've noticed.
Yeah, I'll agree. I think
that's fair.
At the early stage, they have skin in the game. They're going to bring in their connections, their network, potentially a strategic. They may be able to get you in front of the right people to help build out the business.
Yeah, well, I guess to sort of build on that topic, you're maybe looking to hire or bring on your board. Are there any rules of thumb in terms of board member compensation? You know, what should a company be thinking about? You know, a lot of us, you know, they don't really have a lot of cash to pay. It's probably not a good use of funds, but as you said, I think Renee, equity is a common payment there. But how much should companies be thinking about in terms of sort of negotiating these positions with potential board members? What's fair? What's maybe unfair? Do you want to start that one off, Renee?
Yeah, I mean, in my kind of limited experience, typically, I think in a private company situation, the chairman of the board is kind of a granted 1% of options. And then it would cascade from there with probably an independent, depending on if you serve on like I serve on for my public company, both the audit and the comp committee. And then on my private company board, I serve on the audit committee. And so you're sort of given a base level of ownership and then potentially more ownership if you're on one or more committees. And so, it's maybe a 25 basis points, 50 basis points.
Yeah, the range I've seen is sort of 0.5 to 1% as a rule. I would agree.
So don't get a 10-person board at your startup phase.
Correct. They'll eat up your option pool.
What I've seen and what I typically do is it's value based. So again, this is going to go back to stage, right? So you're paying someone essentially a fee or a commission or a annual compensation to sit and do a specific period of work or a specific type of work. And Renee said there's some comps out there. There's some advice out there as to what that annual fee should be. And if you do the backwards math on it and figure out what percentage of that of your cap table based on your valuation that is, you could do it in options, you could do it in equity, you could do it in grants, you could do it, well, it's really warrants, right? Because they're internal, but it's commensurate with the actual work that's being done. So the difference in fee is going to change based on your stage. I hate to sound like a broken record on stage, but that's a big one.
Yeah, no, I think that's really fair. Kind of to wrap up this part, I've heard often kind of common rules of thumb is, make sure you've got an odd number of board members, whatever it is, you don't want 2 or 4 or 6, because if you get a split, and nobody agrees, it can just drive the company to a standstill and things can kind of fall apart or not move forward. So it's good to have an odd number. Dan, have you had experience with sort of board makeups? Is that your experience, or have you seen anything else?
Yeah, I mean, I've been on nothing under 5 is, again, I typically don't come in at the early stage, right, where you might have a smaller board. So 5 to 7, I've been on 6-member boards. Obviously, there's a lot of good reasons to do odd. That's obvious. As Renee said, sometimes you have an open seat for the right time. And that would be one of the 5, 6, or 7 that's just open at the point. Yeah, that's the range that I've, on the how many 10 or so that I've been involved with, either as a CEO or an outside board member. It's typically been that number. I've only been on one not-for-profit board. They tend to be, well, that one was bigger. I think it was probably above 10 now that I think about it. I'm not on it now. I don't have a lot of experience with that, but my view is those tend to be larger for some reason unbeknownst to me.
Brandon, you've been on a lot of boards. Do you have an experience with that?
So what I would say, and this is interesting, is I used to be 5 to 7, same thing. Would put 5 or 7, always thought odd was the way to go, so that you can go make sure that you're always at an answer that provides you with direction. You're never at a standstill. You're never at a stalemate. And what I've learned over the last 4 years or 5 years is that data actually shows the most successful companies have an even number because it forces collaboration. It forces people to say, okay, we're going to get in a group and we're going to make a decision knowing that it might not be the first choice, but we're going to find the solution that works for everybody. And I thought that was very interesting. So there are a lot of case studies out there. I know Harvard Business Review has done some on it to release that, but something I've been looking into, and at Woven Orthopedics now, we have an even number of people on our board. And this is my first foray into an even number of people. I felt that it's been helpful. Time will tell whether, it works for us or not.
That's really interesting. I've not really heard that before. It kind of goes against the common grain for sure, because you hear about a lot of big heads, a lot of strong opinions, and sometimes people don't want to budge. So it sounds like setting yourself up in a dangerous position can have a benefit maybe to the team dynamics.
It's different, right? I think what I've noticed, right, and this is from plenty of prior boards, what winds up happening when you have an odd number, right, and it happens in even 2, but it's odd, is you have a lot of discussions behind the scenes with people who are like, oh, I could just get one extra vote, or I just need to change one person, or I got to do this or that. That's a target to get things passed, to get things done. When you have an even number, it's not really the case anymore, right? Because you'll now have to get more than one, technically speaking. You'd have to have a majority, potentially even a super majority, depending on how many people are on your board. And it just changes the dynamic of the way that people think internally. There was one, I wish I had the examples off the top of my head. IMD, which is an organization over in Switzerland, did a big study and does a whole course on this, actually. So you could take a look at it there too. But it's interesting. It's an interesting one, and we're trying it because it makes a lot of sense. A lot of the data would suggest it. I'm a big proponent of optimism, positivity, and collaboration. So this was one of the things that I've supported and would continue to support to see how it works.
That's great. You have to be an optimist. That's great.
I'll let you know how it goes. We'll see what at the end of the line for us.
We'll be back next year with an update.
Yeah, I liked hearing that. I think one thing that you got to be, cognizant of is, if the CEO has, skewed ownership, then it goes down to basically how many shares, and then sort of nullifies the effectiveness of that board, right?
Is that true, Sammy? I mean, if you're the CEO, you're probably the founder, maybe even of the company. Is there a reason you shouldn't or don't want to have that super control of your company?
I think at the early stage, I think you do, but at some point it grows, right? And if you want to build this for the long haul, you want to build a company, that's going to be of consequence and continue to grow and get funding. You got to bring people to the table that are going to help you. And so it can be contentious if, the board isn't in agreement, and the CEO has the voting shares to do what he or she wants.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Okay.
or anybody for that matter. Renee, Dan, what do you two do if there's a majority shareholder somewhere, right? And typically speaking, what the board votes on is different than what the shareholders would have a vote in. But what do you do if you have a board member who's let's say a super majority shareholder also sitting on the board? They can get overruled at the board level, but they own the majority of the company, right? So what do you do? How do you manage it?
Yeah, I've actually seen it, not where I was the person owning over 50%. I was at J&J, and typically strategics want to be below a 20% threshold-ish. But I have seen it where there was a shareholder who had a very significant position. And I will say, pleasantly surprised, they wanted input from the whole board. They didn't act in a predatory manner. They wanted the best minds. They specifically had these people around the table, and they wanted to hear what everyone had to say. So yes, there was a sort of a secretary who took the votes, and it was done like every other board meeting. You wouldn't know, but I thought it was a very sort of high EQ, mature way of approaching the situation.
Yeah, I personally was involved as the CEO early on in my career. And this was a strategic versus VCs. So that's a whole nother discussion that we probably don't have time for in 10 minutes. But in this case, I don't think it was the majority, but a loud enough voice that the strategic wanted to go a certain way based on their interest versus, in my opinion, the broader interest from back to the fiduciary. And we went the latter. We did, in my view, was the right thing. There was a lot of gnashing of teeth. There were no, legal ramifications that hurt the deal, but we ended up doing, in my view, what was right, and we just sort of plowed through it. I don't know how else to say it.
Yeah. I want to shift gears here because Renee and Dan, you both have sat on international boards, and while a lot of our companies are US, not all of them are, and we got a good number of international companies too. Can you quickly sort of speak to the differences between at least like a European and a US based board, and what that looks like? Are there differences? Anything people need to know about or be aware of, especially as a board member crossing the border, or is a company sort of recruiting across those lines too?
You want to go first, Renee? Go ahead. Feel free.
No, I actually have invested outside the US. I didn't sit on a board. I invested in a Singapore company right before they ended up listing on the Singapore exchange. But I've never sat on a board outside the
Okay.
US.
Yeah, so I was CEO of a Swedish company, and it's basically making sure, in this case, our CFO knew intimately the rules of the road. And so in terms of what I could and couldn't do, I was really not even an official voting board member in that case because of Swedish law, at least at that time. And what becomes public, even as a private company, is very different in Sweden. Very little comes public here. A lot more goes public in Sweden. And so it's really about having somebody to make sure they open your eyes as to how it's going to be different. And interesting, at the end of that one, I merged with a U.S. company, and we ended up staying as a Swedish entity. And so that was really interesting, being in a U.S. PE firm for strategic purposes down the road from an exit perspective and everything else. But it works. They're just different, and I can only speak to one, which was Sweden in this case.
Interesting. Okay. So let's talk about recruiting board members. You guys all sit on boards. What attracts you to a startup? What gets you to say yes? It's probably more than just hey, here's some equity, sit on my board. What are the things that actually interest you? Sammy, can you take this one?
Yeah, usually I'm wearing my technical hat and I see a gap in the marketplace, and it could be a better Me Too product that could essentially, in one case, maybe jump from a research product that can get into the clinic and really start to scale, or something that looks that the market needs, and I believe that there's a gap that we can help move the needle on. And so I tend to have conversations and keep in touch with the CEO and kind of guide them along the journey, and sort of see what it's like in terms of playing together and working together before I make any commitment. So it does take some time, and you got to understand, how the other person is, and how they're going to respond to input and things like that.
Dan, do you need to add?
Well, not so much from what would attract me in a sense, but as far as looking again back to Brandon's famous look at the stage of the company, and things change. And I've one of the things that I believe is I want a board, or specifically a new board member, that we're bringing on because they have a skill set and experience base that's going to help us grow. I want to be challenged. So, while you might bring on a colleague, somebody you don't want to bring somebody that thinks like you do, in my opinion, necessarily. You want somebody that will challenge you. And in general, I like boards that challenge me. I can think of an example where we had a minimal exposure outside the US commercially. So we brought someone that has done that, multiple times in their career. I brought a new chairman on, in this case, who was an ex-colleague, but who I knew would integrate back to the US Swedish. I knew that he would sort of fit that bill of being able to bring, two different groups together, and at the same time guide and challenge me. So, I've used a recruiter in one case. In a couple of cases, it was people I knew, and in third cases, it was a network through a network of somebody I didn't know that ended up being great. So but I'm at the end of the day, there's a reason you're bringing them on. Make sure they have that experience and skill sets. Make sure that you can obviously work with them, but that you're comfortable enough being challenged by them, because ultimately that's what you want to have, again, in my opinion.
Right. Renee, when we think about boards and like kind of how a company should manage their board, how much communication should there be between sort of the founding team and their board? Can you do too much communication? What's too little communication look like? What's the right cadence and what's the right type of interaction? Should they be telling you everything all the time, or how do you kind of see and prefer that
Yeah,
to happen?
again, I'm gonna sort of go to my roots, which is sort of early stage venture backed companies, right? So in the early days, you're probably having 6 board meetings a year, and you're probably checking in with your key board members, um, maybe even as frequently as once a month, in between those board meetings. As the company matures, and again, to Sammy's point, you now start seeing more of the governance, you start seeing kind of the procedures fall into place, and you're having comp committee and nom-gov committee and all this other stuff. It really typically drops down to 4 to 5 board meetings a year. And if I was in the thick of a fundraising or potential strategic partnering situation, or something else was going on, I would probably do a biweekly email to keep everyone up to date. Where I've seen things fall through the cracks is when a financing takes longer and you're not keeping all, because remember, you typically only have a subset of your investors on your board at that given time. You need to make sure you and your CFO, but it falls on the CEO's shoulders, you're communicating the progress and the continued progress to all of your investors. Because when it comes to, especially if there's a pay to play, as we've seen lots of messier deals in the last 2+ years, you want to ensure that everyone will participate at their pro rata rate. And if you're only talking to the one investor who sits on your board, you're going to miss out on a lot of potential capital to come with it. So those are kind of my, kind of ends of the spectrum that I've seen.
Brandon, do you like surprises in the boardroom?
Well, so no, I will never surprise a board member. That's for certain. I would say by the time you get to a board meeting, pretty much a decision has already been communicated. You've talked about things. It's really a formal way to finalize what's been discussed over time. So there's nothing that's just brought up spur of the moment in a formal board meeting. That's for sure. To go to your point about boards, I think there's 2 things about boards. There's really that kind of overarches all of it. It's 2 things about boards and constructing them that I think are important to think about so that we don't overcomplicate it. Number one is, as the CEO, you're responsible for building your board to support the functions of the board, right? They have roles, they have specialties there, whether it's an investor who wants a board seat, hopefully their skill sets match up with the needs that you have. A technical person, they match up with the skill sets you need to have, right? You're responsible for putting the right parties on that bus and then promoting them to the people who vote them in, right? Assuming that that's the case, or appointing them, and keeping the attitude and the mentality positive. The second is, it's then your responsibility to figure out what works best in communicating with each of them, much like a coach to a sports team. You have to figure out what drives each board member so they can do their job to the best of their ability. On my boards, past and present, we have board members who want to communicate every day. We have board members who want to communicate once a quarter. We have board members who are open to being called whenever, other board members who only want to be called at certain times. I personally host an informal update call with my entire board. They can join voluntarily or involuntarily every month if they want to get at least the latest and greatest. But each is going to be a little bit different, and there's no right answer because you're trying to provide them with the information that they need to contribute at the best of their ability, which is unique to everybody. And it's your job to make sure you are putting the people in place who have the skill sets to then allow you to do those and succeed.
Great. We have time for maybe one more quick question. And that question is in terms of the people on the call here today, before we drop off, do you guys have any final sort of words of advice, experience that you want to share with these founders as they're moving forward on their board development journey?
Well, since I'm the oldest, I'll go first. How about that? I, I mean, it's sort of a couple of tidbits that don't necessarily connect. I mentioned earlier strategics versus investors, or in terms of financing, which then ultimately means board seats usually. Think carefully before a strategic enters the room. I mean, and I'll just leave it at that, right? I've seen it work both ways, and right now it's working well in the way at Sequel right now, because you need to think ahead about what that strategic is there for, how will it impact others looking at you, and all that. So again, maybe common sense, but something to think about. Again, I'm not an early stage guy, so maybe it is different in the early stage, but that's sort of one piece of advice. And I guess the only other thing I say is, as a CEO, it's lonely at the top, and it is. And so whether it's the board, a strategic advisory group, or just a mentor, make sure that in some way, shape, or form, that part of your need is met. I think it's really important. I don't care how much experience you have, that outside influence and help, hopefully from the board, but elsewhere, is a good thing. I'll stop right there.
Yeah. Well, that's our time for now. So thank you guys. Stay on the line. We'll stop the live stream here and we'll go into the private discussion. But thanks so much for sharing this with the group, and we'll continue the discussion.